I want to thank you for checking out my report, just in case you read this. My encounter took place years ago, and it now amazes me that I haven't taken the time just to write this down before. It does truly work like therapy, just as so many other people have claimed. The year was 1989, and I was living on the outskirts of Greensboro, North Carolina. I had 3 dogs living with me at the time. 1 black Labrador, 1 yellow Labrador, and 1 German Shepherd mix, all of which were females. The trio of dogs was excellent for the wooded environment that I resided in at the time. They were extremely intelligent and in touch with the natural habitat. None of them was the type to bark for no reason. When they did sound the alarms, it was always because predators were nearby. And let me tell you, nothing intimidated them. At least that's what I once thought. I had been living in that home for over 2 years when I was mysteriously woken up by all of my dogs whimpering at once. All 3 of them slept near the foot of my bed, and the behavior was so unusual that I remember questioning whether I was in a dream state. The German Shepherd, Blair, was doing circles near my bedroom door. It was hard to tell if she wanted to investigate something or if she wanted to escape the bedroom for whatever reason. I tried to hush them for quite some time without any success. None of them were looking toward either of my bedroom windows, so it was more like they had smelled something or heard something that my senses didn't pick up on. Eventually, I became so restless that I let Blair walk out of the room, hoping to get some clue as to what had stirred them up. My other dogs, Greta and Mama, stayed put in my room, continuing their soft whimpers. I grabbed a glass of water while I watched Blair trot in circles around my living room coffee table. I did notice that she was occasionally glancing up towards the windows, but it was apparent that she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. After a few minutes of watching the same thing, I asked Blair back into my bedroom and allowed the 3 dogs to jump up on the bed with me. That was something I so rarely did, but I couldn't think of anything else to do to get them to calm down. There was something about the 4 of us being huddled together that did help them to calm down. For the next couple of weeks, everything in life proceeded as normal. I got to the point where I was able to brush off that strange behavior. I guess I just convinced myself that one of them was overreacting and it caused the others to become concerned for no reason. Then I woke up to the same thing. This time the trio seemed even more worked up than the last time. I'm one of those folks who are woken up very easily and find it very challenging to fall back asleep. Unfortunately, this pattern turned into a regular thing after the second incident, without any indication as to what was getting the dogs so worked up. Even though I didn't have much money to spend on this sort of thing, I brought the 3 of them to be examined by the vet. I was starting to come to a variety of strange theories, one of them being that I might have a terminal illness, and they could somehow smell it, and maybe it was acting up in the night. You hear about all sorts of weird things like that, so I became very open-minded about what could be bothering them so much, since I just couldn't figure it out. After the vet ran tests on all 3 of my dogs and couldn't find a thing wrong with them, I decided to see my own physician for the first time in years. I just wanted to squash the theories. My doctor would end up revealing to me that I was pretty much as healthy as one could get at the age of 44. Even though I was relieved to learn that we were all 4 physically okay, it didn't solve the nightmare routine. It had gotten so bad that I was losing hours of sleep almost every night. It was badly affecting my schedule, and I wasn't getting nearly as much work done on the job. I had searched my yard multiple times without finding any evidence of intruders or rare animals. But there was one day when I came home from work at lunchtime to make a sandwich, and I noticed a few very strange-looking tracks in the dirt by my driveway. The only conclusion that could come to me at the time was that the tracks belonged to some large wolf. But the toes were much longer than any wild dog I knew ever to exist. Additionally, I knew my dogs wouldn't have been that intimidated of a rogue wolf. Together, the 3 of them would have been confident that they could take any intrusive wild animal, and I would tend to agree. It was that same night that my dogs woke up yet again. Even though I was weirded out by the tracks that I found earlier that day, I just couldn't take it anymore. I went outside with a flashlight, and my dogs were essentially screaming. It was as if they were begging me to come back inside. When I closed the door behind me, I could hear them whimpering even louder than ever before. They were super concerned about my well-being, which of course made me extremely nervous. I started pointing the flashlight near the trees, scanning the area for any movement. I remember how still everything felt in that moment. It was as if time itself had stopped. As I neared the edge of the trees, my heart started to beat extremely fast, and I was overcome by this feeling that I shouldn't be out there. My instincts were telling me that I should have listened to my dogs. It was as I was turning around, about to head back inside, that the shine from my flashlight landed on a figure that was more than halfway cloaked by the hanging pine trees. But I could see just enough of it to know it was looking directly at me. Suddenly, I caught sight of this massive head as it steadily ducked beneath the branch. The thing was standing on two legs, but from what I could see of the head, it reminded me so much of my own German Shepherd, only much, much larger, and its face was considerably wider. The creature was multiple shades of dark brown and black and was completely covered with fur. The branch which it lowered its head below was considerably high, making it as clear as day that this thing was no short animal. I don't think it was standing up straight either, but I'm going to throw it out there that I think it was around 8 feet tall. I could see one of the hands, and I say hand because it didn't look like any paw I've ever seen. I could see a long opposable thumb also, and all of the fingers had long nails extending from them. I wanted to turn and run from this thing, but there was no question that it would be able to tackle me before I could get to my door. It truly felt as though I was at this thing's mercy. I had been so devastated by the sighting of this creature that I hadn't even noticed my dogs were now barking louder than ever and clawing at the front door. I think it's because they wanted to protect me and were very aware of what stood on the yards away from me. The creature continued to hunch its head beneath the branch and then bring it back up. It would change its position every few seconds while keeping the rest of its body completely still. I'm not even totally sure that it knew I could see it while it stood behind that tree. Then a slight sigh of relief came over me as I watched the creature swiftly turn and head back into the woods. As I could no longer see it, that's when I did a 180, sprinted towards my front door. It felt as though I was running in slow motion, like I could not get inside fast enough. Thankfully, I made it to the door and slammed it closed behind me. When I walked over to the window to close the blinds, that's when I came face to face with the creature. It was standing only inches away from the glass, its shoulders hunched so that its head was leveled with mine. You're gonna think this sounds insane, but those eyes were purely human. It is because of this experience that I now do not doubt that werewolves, lichens, or Dogman, whatever you want to refer to them, are as real as ever. It didn't take long for me to realize that all three of my dogs had left the room. I guess saying the creature that up close crossed the line, and they were too intimidated to let out another peep, even if it was to warn me, their master. I always wonder what my dogs thought of that creature. Did they know the truth about what it was? Did they see it as some demonic entity, or just another animal that happens to be much, much more powerful? If my theory is correct, could they tell that the creature had human DNA? That is something that has always intrigued me. There's no question that dogs possess senses that are superior to ours, so I badly wish I could have asked my dogs for their analysis of this creature that visited us that night. I remember how the creature's breath quickly began fogging up the glass. It was amazing to me how I never heard it take a single step while it moved toward the house. Maybe I was just too scared to pay attention at the time. But if these creatures are as stealthy as ninjas, that makes their existence all the more terrifying. It continued to stare at me as I slowly backed away from the window. I backed around the corner and into the kitchen, grabbed the largest butcher knife I had, and waited a few minutes, then peeked around the corner. Now I could see nothing through the window. I'm not sure how long I waited, but I stood there, leaned against the counter, pretty much waiting for any sign of noise, or movement, anything at all. But all was silent. Eventually my dogs trotted out from hiding, and I took that as a sign that the creature had vacated the area. My dogs and I stayed up for the remainder of the night, and we went and got a motel room for the following night. I ended up renting an apartment on a month-to-month basis and realized I was too frightened to stay another night at that house. I ended up selling the place to a burly fellow who was really into deer hunting. I assumed that he'd seen enough weird things in the woods and had enough guns, so I didn't hesitate to tell him my story about the encounter. He claimed he had never seen anything that unusual. However, he had heard so many strange noises that he couldn't pinpoint to any known animal. My story didn't deter him from making the purchase, though. If anything, it seemed to excite him and might have even persuaded him to seal the deal. I always told myself I was going to follow up with the purchaser as to whether he had seen this werewolf-like creature, but I never got around to it. I actually sent a letter to my old address not too many years ago, simply asking if the fellow still lived there, but I never received a response, so I left it alone. I don't think I'll ever know for sure what I encountered while living in my old property, but what I do know for sure is that there are so many truths out there that are beyond our wildest imaginations. I just want to say thank you. It's been fun to write all of this down. It's been like therapy, and I greatly appreciate it if you read this. If anyone else has seen anything like this, or just wants to lend their opinion, I would love to hear it. Thanks again. Now, I'm not even 100% positive that what I saw back in 2010 was even a Dogman, but there's nothing else I can think to categorize it as. This story happened in Idaho, in a picturesque vacation town called McCall. I was staying at my buddy's summer home. We had brought a few girls and were spending the majority of the days lying around in inner tubes, and it's very beautiful, just this crystal clear lake that was a few miles from where we stayed. I have to admit, we were all pretty drunk by the time this incident occurred, which might have added to the excitement of the whole thing. But I wasn't so drunk as to made the whole thing up or hallucinated, so please don't be one of those skeptics that claim alcohol consumption manages to make you see things or hallucinate. It's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard, and it drives me bananas. Alcohol doesn't make you see anything, and I wasn't blackout drunk. Fortunately, all 5 of us were near the middle of the surprisingly deep lake when one of the weirdest looking animals I've ever seen appeared along the shore. It was so demented looking that my initial assumption was that we were staring at a human wearing professional special effects makeup. I know that sounds stupid, but at the time, I had a very hard time attributing the look of this animal to anything I'd ever known of. It really was the most random thing ever, and we were all pretty speechless once we laid eyes on this animal that was clearly very focused on us. It was tall and lanky, and I got the impression that it was malnourished, which made the whole sighting a lot creepier because I couldn't help but feel as though it wanted to eat one of us. Its fur was dark gray. I guess you would refer to it as maybe a charcoal. Although its snout wasn't as protruded as what you typically see on a wolf, it stuck out far enough to reveal rows of very sharp-looking teeth. As it walked back and forth on 2 legs near the edge of the lake, it made this faint noise that reminded me a lot of when a small child whines, and there was something about the way it moved that reminded me of a human, although the proportions were very different from any human. "What is that?" one of the girls muttered with a tone that showed she was totally creeped out. I couldn't blame her. It felt like there was only a few yards of water that separated us from what could only be described as a real-life monster. Fortunately, the water was pretty warm, otherwise we probably would have frozen to death while waiting on this animal to move on. We had brought a cooler full of beer and other beverages, and the animal stayed pretty close to it. Maybe it assumed the object belonged to us, and that we'd probably return to it. It didn't do anything other than pace near the large red cooler, keeping its eyes focused directly on us. If it had at least searched the shoreline or surveyed the nearby ground for anything edible, I might have had a different perspective on the whole thing. But no, all it seemed to do was contemplate a way to get us. I suppose for whatever reason, it didn't want to get in the water. If it had wanted to, there's no question that the animal could have made its way to us and dragged one of us back to shore. Even though it was a lanky animal, its bones appeared thick, and it looked as though it was capable of ensuing damage onto any other living organism if it felt it was necessary. I recall how the girls speculated that it must be some kind of bear. Apparently, they thought that bears walked on two legs for long periods, and fluidly like a person. At the time, I thought it was a pretty ridiculous thing to say, but looking back at the incident, who can blame them? I completely understand what other people mean when they talk about how the brain attempts to create logical conclusions at all times, especially when it's in a state of shock while looking at something so out of the ordinary. But even with my mind being blown by the visual, I maintained enough common sense to know that this animal was nothing you'd see inside an issue of National Geographic. "Should we paddle to the other side?" my buddy asked the group. His voice was shaky. It's intriguing to think about the psychological effect this incident had on everyone. Though nobody was saying it aloud, it was as if all of us silently agreed that we were going to die. "No, let's remain in the water," I said. "At least until whatever the thing is no longer in sight. It can't just stay there forever." Now, this is probably going to make me sound like an awful person, but being the crazy teenager that I was, I do remember wishing that other people would appear so that they'd serve as decoys for this predator. But unfortunately, this area was far too secluded. Nobody else ever came. "It's a werewolf," one of the girls whispered. "I mean, what the hell else could it be? That's what it looks like." Everyone else remained silent. Nobody could argue her theory, and I still can't. After all, it truly did resemble a half-man, half-beast type entity. Sometimes the Dogman would wander off towards the woods, only to quickly return and continue staring at us. We must have remained out in the middle of this small lake for an hour or two before it finally left. And even after the animal was no longer visible, we decided to remain out in the water for another 10 or 15 minutes, with each of us focused on a different direction so we could better judge that it was nowhere near. And thankfully, we had parked our car nearby so that we could easily transport the cooler to the lakeshore. Still, we had to drive a considerable distance through the woods, and not a single second went by where I wasn't anticipating an ambush. There was something about that animal that made me suspect it wouldn't hesitate to pounce on a vehicle if it provided the right opportunity. Sometimes we would tell people about how we saw a really strange-looking animal while at that lake, but as you'll probably suspect, nobody's ever believed us. They assumed that we just saw something that was unhealthy, thus altering its appearance and causing us to think that we saw something out of the ordinary. It's amazing how we've been trained to think that monsters don't walk this earth, that it's impossible. It's something I've been trying to figure out for so long. The reasons for keeping so many things secret from the public. It's truly mind-blowing when you run a Google search for just unexplained phenomena, as it sheds light on how many strange encounters there truly are out there. There's just no way that everybody is lying, and after my experience, I can say that is a fact, because I'm not lying. I appreciate you taking the time to read this story. I'd love to hear your opinions, and I greatly appreciate just taking the time to give me some attention. I can't say for certain what it was that I saw back in the late 1980s, but whatever it was, it sparked my passion for cryptozoology and other unexplained phenomena. I was 20 years of age and lived in Lyons, Michigan. Lyons is an extremely small town that currently has a population just over 2,000. Everyone who lives there knows there's not a whole lot going on there. It was spring and we had just opened a local golf course for the season, which is where I worked at the time. I did all kinds of things to keep that place running smoothly. But it was one evening while I was driving the Kubota, which is the cart that gathers the golf balls, that I saw something I'll never forget. I was riding the vehicle out on the driving range when suddenly this large, funny-looking animal emerged from the nearby thicket, carrying a mangled, bloody carcass. I'm pretty sure I was able to make out hooves, so that makes me think it was probably some land animal, such as a deer or possibly a goat. After the strange creature walked a few yards out into the driving range, it just dropped the carcass from its jaws and began shifting its head in all directions. The way it moved made me feel as though it thought another predator was nearby and might come along to try and steal its dinner. Maybe it heard me. It looked in my direction on multiple occasions, but I suppose I was far enough away as to not be any concern. I was so stunned by the sight of this thing that I stepped on the brakes to observe it. I turned around to see that there was still one golfer using the driving range, and it was plain to see that he had also stopped what he was doing due to the sight of this creature. I watched as he took a few steps forward from his tee so that he could get a little bit better of a view. But even from his distance, the sight of this creature was pretty intimidating, preventing him from wanting to get any closer. I was essentially in the middle of this creature and the golfer, and even though I had a steel cage around me, something was starting to tell me that I might not be as safe as I expected. The longer I stared at this creature, the more I realized how dangerous looking it was. Its long snout was full of razor-sharp teeth, large claws extended from strangely shaped hands, kinda like a raccoon, and I could make out very, very prominent muscle definition. The thing that immediately caused me to see that this was no ordinary animal was the fact that it walked on two legs. It doesn't physically make that much sense because the legs had the shape of a dog's, the way theirs bend differently at the knees from ours. If you've ever seen how the legs of demons are often depicted, that is how these were, only with feet or maybe paws instead of hooves. Even though the lower body was very different, the upper body was very similar to that of a muscular human, that is, aside from the head and the hands. But its body language was so different from anything I've ever seen before, man or animal. There was something about its movements that almost made it feel as though it were from a different dimension. I know that sounds strange, but I can't think of any other way to express the odd behavior. It just didn't align with the rest of the environment. Another thing that I thought was strange was how it perceived the driving range as a safe place to munch on its kill. I would never expect for it to perceive any open area as an appropriate place to feed. As I sat inside the caged vehicle, I continued to mentally slap myself, trying to come to terms with what I was staring at. By the time I looked back at the golfer, he was already gone, leaving me entirely alone with this large predator and its carcass. For obvious reasons, I wanted to turn my vehicle around, but with the way the creature would occasionally glance in my direction, my instincts told me that there was a good chance it would follow me, and if I drove away, it might pursue in a chase, and if it did follow, who knew what unsuspecting innocent bystander I might accidentally have lured it to, or maybe even myself. It got to the point where I felt like I had been watching the creature eat this bloody meat for an eternity, motivating me to try and start driving the vehicle towards the concrete path that led to the shed. It was as I began turning the vehicle around that something from the opposite direction seemed to capture the creature's attention. I watched as it stood up as tall as it could go, as it perked its head up and looked toward the woods, then stepped in front of its prey, seemingly blocking any view of it. That was when I felt as though I could guess that its height was somewhere between 7 and 9 feet. So I was slowly turning away when, out of nowhere, the creature sprinted toward the same section of the woods where it came out of. Whatever it was running toward concerned it so much that it left its prey behind. What I initially thought was that there was something in the woods that had it worried enough to cause it to head in the opposite direction. However, the way it ran towards the woods left me believing that there was competition, or that maybe it recognized another means of prey. Of course, it's something I'll never know, and I still to this day have trouble accepting what I saw. This sight was so out of this world that I don't think I'll ever fully accept it. I made it safely back to the garage, parked the vehicle, and went home. I mentioned it to my manager that there was a strange animal out in the driving range, but I didn't get too detailed on the notion that it looked like a monster. All I said was that it looked like some sort of large dog, and that it might be dangerous, so he should consider calling animal control or something. I did return to work the following day, and the mangled carcass was gone. Nobody that I worked with spoke of it, so my theory is that the creature did come back sooner than later to retrieve it. Anyway, that's the gist of my report. Appreciate your time, and hopefully you share this with the world. Thanks again. Alright guys, that's everything I have tonight. I just wanted to say, thanks for taking the time to listen to this. If you haven't already, please hit that like. It really helps it out a lot. The more you like my stuff, the more people get to see it. I have set up a Patreon. I don't want anybody to feel obligated, but any money coming in from this is just going to get put right back into the channel. The more I get, the more I can produce, the more I can create, and the more I can give back to you guys. So consider it, no obligation. Thanks for listening, and I definitely will see you all in the next one.